Welcome to Talks at Google. The Emperor has been expecting you. Today, the Empire is honored to host the author of How Star Wars Conquered the Universe, the past, the present, and future of a multi-billion-dollar franchise. He is Chris Taylor, the deputy editor of Mashable, dedicated Star Wars fan, author, and Jedi Knight. Perhaps you wonder why events from a galaxy far, far away have so much force power. It is useless to resist. Join me, and together with our combined strength, we can welcome Mr. Chris Taylor and bring order to the galaxy. I've been waiting for you, Obi-Wan. We meet again at last. The circle is now complete. When I left you, I was but the learner. Now I am the master.
Only a master of evil, Darth.
Ah!
No, enough of this. I've got to talk to Gib.
As
we'll
you
pick
wish.
this up later. Good work, everyone. All right. Well, that's one crossed off the bucket list. Doing a talk at Google and doing a talk at Google in Jedi robes. It's quite spectacular. Are we on? All right. Well, greetings, everyone. Thanks for coming out. Thank you, Darth. Only you could be so bold. My name is Chris Taylor. I'm the author of How Star Wars Conquered the Universe, which is, I have to pinch myself every time I say this, the first complete history of the franchise and its fandom. And I very much wanted to show both aspects, both the history and the example of folks like Mr. Vader here, who tend to take their love for the movie in a very creative direction. So that's what it's about. We've been getting some good reviews, as you can see. And but what I wanted to talk about today is about Star Wars and creativity. Star Wars is an example of a creative project that really consumed its creator, but also took a lot of collaboration, way more collaboration than we imagine when we think of the original Star Wars movie. But first, let me tell you a bit about me and where I started. I was the San Francisco correspondent for Time magazine, and I wrote my first story about Star Wars in April 1999 in the Phantom Menace preview issue. I'd not yet seen the movie. That's a whole other issue. We can get into that. But this was about a year before I came and wrote the first Time magazine story on Google, so it's good to be back. That's sort of where I started. That's where I started professionally writing about Star Wars. But here's where I really started, with the back of a cereal box in 1978, where we, in the UK, we had Letraset figures. Darth Vader, you're very off-putting. We had, yes, I believe we could use Darth Vader on the back of a cereal box here. There were various figures that you had to rub on. There were droids, there were Stormtroopers. It was just like that. It was exactly what it looked like. That was my introduction to Star Wars. There were several cereal boxes that told the whole story of the movie. You rub the figures on. It was a very interactive experience. I then collected the comic books. I collected the action figures, as I'm sure a lot of you did. I didn't see the movie itself until 1982, so I was already fully aware that it was this sort of transmedia property, that it did what a lot of franchises do today, and jump the media barrier. It started off as a novel. People often forget that. The novel came out first, before the movie. We'd already read the entire story, then we saw it. So to move on to the talk itself, the title is courtesy of Seattle's Town Hall, which this is a slightly adapted version of the talk. The Star Wars Spell, or How the First 10 Minutes of Episode 4 Teaches You Everything You Need to Know About Collaboration, Ruthless Self-Editing, and Hooking an Audience. And it's my belief that the lessons you will learn here can apply to just about any project if it has any creativity to it or any collaboration to it. And it is proof that filmmaking is a fundamentally collaborative endeavor. So why the first 10 minutes? Well, this is the answer. This is Fred Weintraub, and not Bruce Lee, but the guy who produced Enter the Dragon. And when George Lucas sold his first movie, THX 1138, to Warner Brothers hated it. If any of you have seen it, it's a very difficult movie. Regardless of the quality of it, it's hard to squeeze into that kind of 10-minute time frame exactly what the movie is about. Fred Weintraub tried to get George Lucas to re-edit the movie. George refused. They made a few cuts, which angered George no end. But this was his dictum. And George actually follows it more closely in his later movies than he did in THX. Because if you look at the first few minutes of THX, the first 10 minutes, it's kind of confusing. It's a mess. It starts with a Buck Rogers trailer. It actually says Buck Rogers in the 20th century, not the 25th century, which a lot of people missed. But that was the whole point of the movie, that THX was Buck Rogers in the 20th century. It then goes on to the credits, scrolling the wrong way up the screen. Confusing shots of people getting fed pills by machines in their pill cabinet. THX's roommate there being very depressed at her work. THX buying products that we don't know what they are, going into a confessional booth. It's not necessarily the sort of stuff that's going to hook you in. So Fred Weintraub suggested changing that, adding some action sequences maybe. George completely ignored him. But by the time of his next movie, the one that made him a millionaire, American Graffiti, he'd loosened up, he'd lightened up. This was a character study. It basically tells you the plot of the whole movie, the stakes of the whole movie in the first 10 minutes. College kids trying to decide if they're actually going to go away for college at the end of the summer. Is the couple going to break up? Is the guy in the souped-up racer actually going to meet the out-of-town guy played by Harrison Ford? We hear mention of as early as the first 10 minutes. So, he sort of started to get that dictum, but still, American Graffiti was a very character-driven movie. So when we come to the first 10 minutes of Star Wars, it was George Lucas's attempt to push himself into plot, which he'd never really tackled before. THX was very much an independent movie. It was kind of anti-plot in a lot of ways. Scenes were just sort of thrown together almost at random. And American Graffiti was more of a character study, still not quite a plot-rich movie. He wanted to go for speed and motion, give you this incredible sense of moving very fast, partly because he was upset that the special effects did not live up to his imagination. And particularly in 2001 was sort of the gold standard for special effects. So he cut very quickly through the special effects. So, there had to be this sense of speed and motion. And he had a very, very tiny budget, which officially was $8.5 million, which was less than you would spend on an average studio comedy at the time. It actually ballooned to $11.5 million, but that was not the intention. So that's what he was trying to achieve in a very small space of time. Keep you in the theater, give you enough of the plot that you were hooked, and get the sense of speed and motion going throughout the film. So let's take a look at those first 10 minutes, and let's start with this question. A little bit of audience participation. What is the first thing you would have seen at a Star Wars screening on May the 25th, 1977? What's the first thing that comes on screen? Any guesses? No? What's before that? There was actually no trailers before the movie in 77.
21st Century Fox fanfare?
The Fox fanfare was before a long time ago, but actually it's a trick question because it was none of these things. It was Duck Dodgers in the 24th and a half century. Was shown before all 70mm screenings of Star Wars, which is all you could see in the first week. And it really gave you a sense that this was supposed to be a little bit of a comedy. Star Wars is lighthearted, and I think a lot of people forget that. It really got its character in the final draft, where George had some of his friends, Willard Hike and Gloria Katz, do this sort of comedic rewrite, where you get the interplay between Han Solo and Princess Leia. So it had an incredible lightness to it. He talked about the exuberance of this movie, and Duck Dodgers really sort of got you into that mind frame. All right, so after Duck Dodgers, of course, yes, the Fox fanfare was next, 20th Century Fox fanfare. If you look closely, there's a tiny hair in the gate on the screen. There's the original 77 version because, it was just a movie and you didn't have, millions of people going over and digitally cleaning up stuff like this. And the 20th Century Fox fanfare at the time wasn't used. It was just 20th Century Fox. That would just been silent had George Lucas not stepped in and said, no, actually, I really like that fanfare. Let's revive it. It had sort of fallen out of favor in the 70s. Now, the fanfare was the work of Mr. Alfred Newman, who was a composer in Hollywood in the 30s. He composed it in 1933, re-recorded it 2 years later, added a little bit in the 50s, which is the part that plays over the Lucasfilm logo. People often assume that's actually a Lucasfilm fanfare. It's not true. And revived by George Lucas in 1977. So, if we were to, it's just a bit of fun, try to score the first 10 minutes of Star Wars and say who was responsible for what, give them points. Let's give half a point to Alfred Newman for composing the fanfare in the first place and half a point to George Lucas for deciding to resurrect it. So you already get a sense of this collaboration across decades, which we're going to see a lot more of in the first 10 minutes. So what comes next? Obviously this, not the upgraded version that we know from the special edition, but just a very simple green on black version of Lucasfilm Limited. Now what's interesting about this, you don't get any credits before the movie other than this. If you wanted to know who directed Star Wars in 1977 and you just went into the theater, you wouldn't know it, which was very unusual at the time. In fact, there were only 3 other major movies that had done this before, and they were all pretty awesome movies. Citizen Kane, Fantasia, and West Side Story. This would eventually get George Lucas into a lot of trouble with the Directors Guild and the Writers Guild, but that would be in the next movie. But they tried to insist that he put the name of the director on the screen before Empire Strikes Back. He refused, paid a massive fine, but he didn't want anything to interfere with the fourth wall. So if we're keeping score, let's give George Lucas an extra point for keeping that fourth wall intact and getting us straight into this fairy story that he'd written. And then what comes up at the beginning of the fairy story? We all know those famous words. And in the time of greatest despair, there shall come a Savior, and he shall be known as the Son of Sons. Journal of the Wills, chapter 3, verse 127. No, obviously this was not on the screen at the beginning of Star Wars. This was the second draft, and the third draft of the movie had this as the opening title, because George Lucas was much more in the vein of thinking that he was writing a Bible story. He'd been studying a book called The Golden Bough. It talks about religious ritual and trying to collect and gather and simplify. This was way before Hero with a Thousand Faces. He was very much into the Golden Bough. And that was the result. And it was such a clever line, the son of the sons, that he didn't really feel like he could let go of that, I guess, in the third draft. Now, the fourth draft, he adds this, which is much more fairy tale-like, but it's still got that curious, corny, an amazing adventure took place at the end of it. So by the time he gets to the movie, he edits it again, and we have what we all know and recognize, those 10 words, which I think are pretty revolutionary words, possibly the most revolutionary title card in the history of cinema. Now, why? To explain that, let's turn to beat poet Allen Ginsberg. I bet you didn't expect him to show up, who said, "Oh, thank goodness I don't have to worry about it." According to his companion, he was watching it in Denver, Colorado in 1977. Those were his words when A Long Time Ago in a Galaxy Far, Far Away came up on the screen. So why? Because it was the 1970s, because just about every movie had something for you to worry about. And even in science fiction cinema, you weren't safe. You'd go to see Planet of the Apes, and the Statue of Liberty would show up in the last reel. And it would turn out to be this allegory about how we blew ourselves up and the apes took over, yada yada. And a lot of people didn't necessarily feel good about that. This was the age of Chinatown and Taxi Driver, The Exorcist. It was a lot of really dark stuff. So this, up on the screen, immediately announces, don't worry, it's got nothing to do with your time, your place, your planet. Forget about it. This is fantasy. Relax. So people did. So let's add an extra point to George Lucas's score for self-editing. He's looking pretty good so far. Let's see how he goes. So the logo. Yeah, you don't recognize this logo necessarily. It was used on the poster. It was used on T-shirts, and it was supposed to be used at the very start of the film. It was supposed to just be a continuation of the crawl. The crawl sort of goes up like that. Well, the logo was supposed to do that too, until the very last minute when they had an outside agency design a logo for the brochure for Star Wars that theater owners would look at. And this is the designer of the Star Wars logo we know and love, Susie Rice. That's about the only picture you can find of her online. But she was the freelance logo designer who came in and was told something very curious by George Lucas to describe this logo that he wanted her to design for the brochure. He said he wanted it to be very fascist, something to rival AT&T, big and brassy and bold and in your face. But his use of the word fascist caused Susie Rice no end of trouble when she retells this story now. So she went away and she thought about it. She looked at Helvetica designs for some reason. I guess she associated that with fascism. And this is what she came up with. This was actually the third version of the design. Lucas had complained because the S and the T were separate and the R and the S were separate, that it looked like Tar War. So she went away and linked those letters up and came back, and he said, great. Finally on the third go, he accepted it. And Joe Johnston, to be a famous designer and a famous filmmaker in his own right later on, flattened those W's. This version was, however, used in the brochure. But they flattened the W's, and just for fun, they thought, well, let's throw this on the screen at the beginning of the movie and see what it looks like. And it looked like that. And Gary Kurtz, the producer, called up Susie Rice a few days later and said, we tried your logo, and wow. And that's when she learned that her logo was going to be the first thing you see on screen at the very beginning of the movie. And she is now, much older, sees it every day of her life on a T-shirt or a baseball cap or a lunchbox, because Star Wars is so ubiquitous in our lives. And she didn't even get a movie credit for this logo. But that's the way of the world. You're a freelancer. You've got to accept it. You're sanguine. She's happy that it just, represents some incredible work in her life, and she got a chance to be a part of it. So the score is getting a little complicated. George has 3 points, a variety of less than 1 point. Let's get Susie Rice on the board there for the logo design. Now, after the logo, we get the crawl, of course. And what comes immediately after the logo? Perhaps episode 4, A New Hope, right? Nope. No, episode 4, no A New Hope. That was introduced in 1981 not for the re-release, but the re-release of Star Wars after The Empire Strikes Back came out and announced that it was episode 5, and everyone said, what the hell? Which was sort of why they didn't include it for episode 4. Gary Kurtz says they were thinking about starting it somewhere in the middle, maybe episode 3, episode 4, episode 5, but that Fox said no, and Kurtz says actually they were right. It was ridiculous. You go to see a new movie and it says episode 3 up there or episode 4, you would say, what? What the hell? But this was the idea. They were trying to connect it to Flash Gordon. Star Wars is very, very, very much an homage to Flash Gordon more than anything else. And the only Flash Gordon serial to have the roll-up, the famous roll-up, is actually Star Wars. Flash Gordon Conquered the Universe, where I get the title of the book. Flash Gordon Conquers the Universe. That's chapter 4 there. That's what it looks like. So they were trying to emulate that, this notion that you've just walked in, and it's the middle the middle episode of a serial. But they did not say so explicitly in 1977. And there was some doubt about whether they ever would. The initial title for The Empire Strikes Back was Star Wars Episode 2. So the numbering system, much later in the day. So let's get George Plimpton on the board. He was the writer of Flash Gordon Conquers the Universe. And George Lucas still way ahead there, but let's see what we've got coming here. So the crawl, the famous Star Wars roll-up. If you look at the text on the left, that is the crawl as written by George Lucas. And you can see how much longer it is than the final version, and how much redundancy there is in there. In the book, I sort of go through as if I were a line editor on this project and kind of point out the amount of redundancy and editorializing and all of the other stuff that you don't need, and the fact that it doesn't mention the Death Star, it doesn't mention what we're about to see on the screen, Princess Leia's ship. There's a clever reference to the Hidden Fortress, which has its own connection to Star Wars history. But it was edited down to a 1 minute and 20-second crawl that just tells you everything you need to know. And it was edited down not by George Lucas, but by Brian De Palma, director of Carrie and many other famous movies, and their friend Jay Cox, who was a film critic for Time magazine at the time, later a filmmaker in his own right. They sat down at the typewriter together the day after seeing and hating, in Brian De Palma's case, an early screening of Star Wars. And he would, criticize the lack of blood. He would criticize all this Force stuff. He didn't like the ensemble nature of the movie. But mostly he said that crawl at the start is too long. Let me re-edit it for you. And George said, okay. He was already open to other ideas, to collaboration. So thank Brian De Palma for that. Let's give him a point. 10th of a point for Jay Cox for keeping the crawl short. And of course, what do you get simultaneously with this but the music? The oxygen of Star Wars, as Paul Bateman, a Star Wars expert and Ralph McQuarrie collaborator, described it. I think it's a great description. It is by far the best thing about the movie. I think, George Lucas would actually say that. It is the only part that exceeded his expectations of the movie. He's said on many occasions that the original Star Wars, not the special edition, the original was about 25% of what he wanted it to be. He had this grandiose vision and it didn't even come close. But the music, he loved the music so much, he played half an hour of it to Steven Spielberg over the phone. After they recorded it, Spielberg was crushed because John Williams still had to record the Close Encounters theme, and he was worried George had got his best work out of him, which he kind of had. And it's an amazing piece of music, and it's all Williams, but even he had his influences, and the biggest influence is to Eric Wolfgang Korngold, who wrote a movie called King's Row, starring a man named Ronald Reagan. Sort of launched the serious part of his acting career. And if you listen, go to YouTube, listen to the opening theme from King's Row, you will hear some very familiar notes. It is basically the beginning of the Star Wars theme. So, he did a little pastiche. He was hearkening back to the romantic cinema of the 1930s and 40s. So let's give him 3.5 points, and the composer of the 1930s can get another half a point. And so John Williams pulls up level with George Lucas in the score of who was responsible for the first 10 minutes of Star Wars. And there are 8 minutes to go. So we've done the crawl, which ate up 1:20. Fox didn't want it at all. They didn't think that kids would read anything on the screen. Lucas said it's about time they started. So we get this beautiful map painting by Ralph McQuarrie, and then we just pause there for 20 whole seconds. But the music is telling you that something is about to come on the screen. There's some danger. And of course there is. And people sort of extend the next scene in their heads. Of course, the scene of the Star Destroyer chasing the tiny blockade runner, the Tantive 4. And everyone in 1977 and ever since has sort of had this experience of when the Star Destroyer goes overhead, it just seems to keep going and going and going, and until you get to the engines, and you're like, wow, it's the most amazing spaceship I've ever seen. So, anyone care to hazard a guess at how long that shot actually lasts?
8 seconds.
Hello? 8 seconds, wow. You're the first person to guess less than what it actually is, but it's actually 13 seconds for the whole Star Destroyer shot. The length of it, you entirely create in your head. It's actually half the length of a commercial. And then we cut to a reverse shot, and it plays around with it a little bit. But that famous opening scene, only 13 seconds long. The ILM people were terrified that the ship would wobble just ever so slightly, which would completely destroy, your suspension of disbelief for the whole movie. This is my favorite pastiche of that moment from Blue Harvest, the Family Guy spoof. The Star Destroyer is the SUV of space, and that is what Richard Edlund, the cameraman at ILM, for this segment, lost sleep, just imagining that people would stand up in the audience when they showed the movie and shout, "Model!" But of course they didn't. They stood up and cheered. So, sweeping in at number 1, 5 points for everyone at ILM, especially John Dykstra, who created the Dykstraflex camera, which was this very complex thing with motors and computers, but no actual graphical interface. You just had to sort of hook the computers up to these old VistaVision cameras, and it was all spaghetti wires, and they were totally just spitballing when they did this. It was full of hypotheses that hadn't been tested, but it changed the face of special effects cinema. So, they get a lot of credit for the most amazing opening in cinema ever, I would argue, and and changing special effects forever. Everyone tried to copy that afterwards, unless they were Dykstra and his team. They couldn't do it. So we cut from the Star Destroyer to inside the Rebel blockade runner, and the first character who speaks in Star Wars is anyone? 3PO. 3PO, did you hear that? They shut down the main reactors. Will be destroyed for sure. This is madness. So, 3PO. Who is 3PO? Or what is 3PO? I would say who. Let's give him the benefit of personhood. 3PO is George Lucas remembering that he really enjoyed Metropolis when he saw it for the first time in film school, remembering that robot, that sort of golden robot. There's actually a female robot in Metropolis, and 3PO was very much designed as a female robot. So he remembers that. Ralph McQuarrie in the top right goes away and designs his own version of it, looking much more like the Metropolis robot than the final version. Then we have Liz Moore, a sculptor, died tragically young after sculpting the head of 3PO. And of course, Anthony Daniels playing the robot, but he was not supposed to be the voice of 3PO. Lucas actually imagined some sort of sleazy guy, some public relations guy, some used car salesman, was how he described it. And that's what he heard in his head when he was writing all of C-3PO's lines throughout all of Star Wars. But because Anthony Daniels matched his voice so perfectly to these fussy, sort of British butler kind of movements, Lucas went through, I think, about 20 voice actors when he came back to LA to try and loop these lines for 3PO. Eventually he said, "Tony, you got it." And Anthony Daniels looped his own lines, and 3PO is the droid that we know him today because of that, but could have been easily very different. And as you see, takes a lot of collaboration. Takes a village to make a Star Wars movie. As for R2, his companion, who is R2? Well, this is George Lucas remembering the robots from Silent Running, if you've ever seen that. One Silent Running fan in the house. A 1972 movie that bombed at the box office, but had gardens in space and had 3 robots, Huey, Dewey, and Louie. And that's what they looked like. They sort of clumped around and they were square. So Ralph McQuarrie again said, well, okay, if they were square, I'll make R2 round. And that's why he designed it. There was actually a lawsuit filed by Universal against Fox and Lucasfilm because of the imitation of silent running. There were so many movies that sort of imitated Star Wars. The only movie to actually be hit with a lawsuit for imitation in the 70s, the only science fiction movie to be hit with a lawsuit, was Star Wars. So that didn't work out so well. They eventually settled after many, many years. But that was the original idea for R2. He'd have claws coming out of his head. He would throw himself forward on his legs like a man on crutches. It didn't actually end up that way. It was all they could do to actually keep him going as a remote control model, which is what he is for most of the movie. He doesn't have Kenny Baker inside him for nearly all the scenes. He's this remote control droid who is always 2 seconds away from hitting a door, which you'll see if you go back and watch the Star Wars, watch the original Star Wars movie. You'll see all these scenes where R2 is sort of, if you continue his trajectory, he's going to hit the scenery, and he usually does, but they cut just before that point. And of course, the voice was Ben Burt in the lower right-hand corner. It's actually his own voice run through a synthesizer. He's doing baby talk, just sort of babbling, and they went to great lengths to try and match it up with the movement of R2's head. And that's why this monocular trash can actually looks and feels like a very sympathetic character, almost a pet. So if we're keeping score, it's getting a little too complicated, so let's just have everyone else get 2 points for all their work on the droids. George Lucas gets 2 points, and everyone else is fully in the lead on this one. Sorry, George. And then we get the soldiers. So, we've established that the droids are there, the soldiers, they're rushing towards this door. They are completely silent. They're extras, you don't want to pay them. And the interesting point, I think, is that the only ones you see in close-up are old. And what does this say? They're old and they're kind of scared of what's happening. So already, you've got this rich potential for backstory. Maybe you're thinking in your head, maybe they're veterans, they veteran space soldiers, and they're scared of what's coming. So it must be pretty scary. This goes on for a minute, and they really ramp up the tension. They really cut between the Star Destroyer going overhead, grasping the tiny blockade runner, and these soldiers freaking out in the corridor. Even though this was the resources of the movie and of George Lucas, stretched gossamer thin. Very cheap set, no dialogue, $50,000, which the producer had to beg 20th Century Fox to wire him an extra $50,000 so that they could actually shoot this scene one day, the last day of filming in London, and shoot it from 3 different camera angles, so you had enough footage to put something together at the end of the day. Looks great to us, looks like a Hollywood movie to us, actually a very thinly stretched independent movie production. So, who comes through the door? Of course, the Stormtroopers. And they're a bit misty, you can't really see at this stage what they're like, and they're actually good marksmen at this stage. The rest of the movie, they can't hit anything, but at this stage, they're killing rebel soldiers left and right, which is very surprising. There are a number of fan theories about that, we can get into that. But who designed the Stormtroopers? Well, Lucas had sort of been working for years on this notion of Star Troopers. We have his roommate, Randall Kleiser at USC, talks about how he would try to encourage George to go out for parties while they were both at school, and George just wanted to stay in and sketch Star Troopers. This is long before he'd made even THX. So he's obviously thinking of this notion of space soldiers, Star Troopers. Space soldiers is actually what Flash Gordon was called when it was on TV. Little known fact. I make the argument in the book that's part of what inspired Lucas, this notion of space soldiers. We know that he was sketching space soldiers in class and got a rebuke from his teacher for doing so, but he kept doing it. Who else is responsible? Ralph McQuarrie for the initial design. Nick Pemberton is the guy who did the maquette, the sculpture of the Stormtrooper helmet. His friend Andrew Ainsworth produced the first plastic versions, which actually led to a lawsuit in the UK that lasted for about, I think, 4 years, ended up in the Supreme Court. That finally gave Ainsworth the right to keep producing these helmets because they were ruled as a prop rather than a sculpture. A very complicated case. Again, I go into further depth in the book. So if you're keeping score, I think we can see the trend line here, right? Everything is as much everyone else's responsibility for all these creative tweaks as it is George Lucas's. So, again, sorry, George. Then what happens? Then you get this moment. So the droids are crossing the corridor filled with laser fire right in the middle of the battle between the soldiers and the Stormtroopers. And they don't get a scratch on them. And audiences tend to laugh at this point. It is that sort of moment of, okay, it's kind of a kid's movie, but also these droids are kind of our Shakespearean fools. They're our Kurosawa peasants. They will survive everything. That's what this scene is signaling. If you're okay with that, you're on board, you've made the leap of faith necessary to appreciate the rest of Star Wars. Very essential moment. And after that, the battle is over. And who comes in but our old friend? It's your moment, Darth, your moment to shine. So what is Darth Vader? The sound of Darth Vader is Ben Burt breathing through a scuba mask. It's Dave Prowse, British bodybuilder and star of Clockwork Orange. Inside the suit, it's James Earl Jones doing the voice, although not initially. He doesn't actually speak in this first scene. It's Fred Roos, the casting guru, who did The Godfather Part 2, and actually in the initial Godfather as well, he cast that, American Graffiti. And he insisted, no, you've got to have James Earl Jones as Darth Vader. And George said, well, I don't know, it's the token black guy, inside a black costume, maybe that's not cool. And Fred Roos was just like, forget about that. He's the best baritone in the business. You want it. It's not about race. John Mollo did the costume design. It was incredibly cheap, about $1,000 for all those motorcycle leathers and the cape and the fiberglass helmet. And the music cuts out at this point. For the first point in the whole movie, it's just been music, music, music. Then it cuts out. You hear Vader breathing. And as Gary Kurtz, the producer, says, this was an invitation to hiss at the villain. Exactly, thank you. Hiss at Darth, hiss. And people hadn't done this at the theater for years. I mean, you have to maybe go back to the 1920s, the silent melodramas where people would hiss the villain when he would tie the heroine to a railroad track, right? That was hissing. But suddenly, and I hear this again and again from people who saw it in '77, people hissed when Vader came out. It was amazing. One guy was like, maybe some lizard part of their brain just knew instinctively. You just had to hiss the villain. So he just appears in frame and then walks out. He walks off. We don't even hear the voice in this first appearance. And then we were supposed to get this scene where 3PO is all wrapped up in wires and he's going, help, help. That's supposed to be what has happened. So there was this kind of tiny explosion at the end of that corridor scene. They cut this. It didn't quite work here. They moved it towards the end of the movie where he's in the Millennium Falcon and they've just blasted away at all the TIE fighters. Everyone's saying, we did it, we did it. And then you cut to 3PO and the massive wires going, help, help me. I think I'm melting. And it worked so much better there. It's such a great laugh line there, but it was not intended there. That was Marsha Lucas and her team of editors at work, as they are throughout this whole sequence, doing absolutely sterling work with very limited materials. So that's cut. We just see 3PO seeing R2 meeting a mysterious woman. Now about those buns. We don't hear her talk, by the way. This is just, Carrie Fisher's first appearance. She takes her hood off, inserts something in R2, walks off. Those buns were supposed to be redolent of Mexican revolutionaries at the turn of the century. And, many people have suggested other origins. It looks a bit Scandinavian, perhaps. No, Mexican revolutionaries. Now, we're running a little short on time, so let's run through the next 5 minutes pretty quickly, because we've only got to 5 minutes through. at this stage. We've had all of this plot and all of these incredible characters come on the screen just 5 minutes into the movie. So the next 5 minutes, we have an incredible amount of plot. We have Vader strangling the commander of the Tantive, Captain Antilles, trying to get the location of the plans, dangling him off the floor, which was, by the way, the reason that Star Wars eventually got a PG rating, is because Gary Kurtz was recording the audience at that first test screening at the North Point Theater in San Francisco, and a child, on the recording you can hear a child crying at that point when Vader strangles the captain. And so that's how Gary Kurtz was able to say to the ratings board, look, this is actually a PG movie. It's not a G. Let's bump it up to PG because that's more acceptable to teens and they're a bigger audience. So thank you to whoever that child is who cried at the strangulation of Captain Antilles. They changed the history of Star Wars. Carrie Fisher gets her moment with the gun. She manages to, as far as we know, kill a Stormtrooper. So she's pretty badass right from the start. Then we get the very first shot that ILM ever did. This is, they'd spent $1 million by this point, which was half of their budget, and they'd only got one shot. It's because they were spending all their time on the Dijkstraflex, the computer-controlled camera. They spent all their time and money on it, and because they only had one shot in the can when Lucas came back from London, he started getting an anxiety attack. He thought it was a heart attack. He checked himself into the hospital. He was fine. But it just goes to show, you can spend most of your money on R&D and then still produce something spectacular. In fact, that was the only way they were going to do it. So Dykstra was proved right on that. Then we get this, Darth Vader, only you can be so bold scene, which is actually Carrie Fisher's first and only speaking line. And really at this stage, she's the only human character in this movie who's at all sympathetic. It's incredible. Everyone is masks. You have a few Imperial officers. Vader gets debriefed by one of them. He suggests torturing his daughter, who we don't know is his daughter at this stage, wasn't supposed to be his daughter. Leave that to me. And then we cut back down to where the escape pod has landed on the planet of Utapau, as it was then, not Tatooine. When they filmed this, it was still called Utapau. And that is the 10-minute point. We cut to the planet. 3PO kicks R2. They go their separate ways. And are you hooked? I mean, it depends if you think these guys are heroes, right? Are they strong enough characters to you yet? Are they real? So it really, doubles down on the importance of Anthony Daniels' performance and of the design of R2 and the sound of Ben Burt's baby talk through the synthesizer. And everyone from high to low in society in 1977 said, it's amazing. These characters, these droids, you care about them. Peter Glenville was a friend of Alec Guinness's and a big theater guy. He'd just done Man of La Mancha in New York, and he managed to see it before Alec Guinness did. And he wrote to him full marks for the creation of these sort of robot versions of Don Quixote and Sancho Panza, which I think is a great way to describe R2 and 3PO. So that's it. That's the 10-minute mark. That's the first 10 minutes of Star Wars. It hooked, obviously, everyone who saw it. But there's another thing about it. There's almost nothing in it. Right? I mean, who is not in the first 10 minutes of Star Wars? This guy. And this guy. And this guy. And that dude. And that scary old guy. And those creatures. And that thing. It's not a moon. And that stuff. No lightsabers. Almost none of what we associate with Star Wars is in the first 10 minutes. And that actually turned out to be to the movie's advantage as well. For as much as it's dragged you in, it also allows you to pick up the plot if, let's say, there's a giant line outside the theater, they've started screening the movie already, as they did in 1977, and you just get in and the first 10 minutes of the movie are already over. But you can pick it up. Okay, there are these droids, they're wandering the desert, they're in this giant robot U-Haul, someone's kidnapped them, someone's going to sell them into slavery, someone's going to buy them. Okay, you've got it. You've got all you need to know. and but you've still got all this ahead of you. So it's a really phenomenal achievement that it manages to simultaneously drag you in, pack in so much information, give you this sense of speed and motion and movement and all this stuff out of the corner of your eyes that you didn't even notice, like the silver version of 3PO that's behind him in the very first scene. And yet still allows you to pick it up. It's an incredible achievement, but George's friends did not think so. They gave him these early notes on the plot of the film, and especially on the first 10 minutes. Brian De Palma said you vaporized the audience. Nobody's going to be following along at this stage. And Don Glut, a friend of his from USC, who wrote the novelization of The Empire Strikes Back, says, even now, he says, who's the hero? He doesn't get it. It's an ensemble movie, and it shouldn't work on paper. The droids lead you to the princess, who leads you back to the droids who go to this planet. Then Darth Vader comes in, and then Luke comes in, and he takes you to Obi-Wan, who takes you to Mos Eisley, who takes you to Han Solo, who takes you to the Death Star. It's so confusing when you think about it. If you'd never seen it, and someone described it to you, you would be lost. And indeed, people were when Lucas read them the script, until you actually see it. And it just makes this incredible amount of difference. But there was one criticism that stuck. It'll look like THX 1138. Hal Barwood and Matthew Robbins, both friends of Lucas, felt that 3PO, making 3PO and R2 sort of the heroes of the first 10 minutes, would remind people of the robot policeman in THX 1138. And they were like, George, you're going to look like this cold science fiction guy again, which is kind of the complaint about THX. So against his instincts, he filmed this scene that, had they had their way, his friends would have said, insert this into the movie. Use up half of those first 5 minutes, because this is a very long scene, with this stuff down on the planet where Luke sees through his binoculars the space battle going on. He runs into the Toshi station. This is where he was going to pick up the power converters. And gets his friends to come out and take a look. Hey, there's a big space battle going on. Of course, it's finished by the time they take a look. But his friend Biggs is back. Yay, Biggs. He went away to the academy, but now he's sort of telling him secretly that a lot of bad stuff is going down, and they've nationalized commerce in the Outer Rim, I believe. It gets very complex and political, as George tended to do, when given free rein. And it just would have killed the movie dead. It really would. You can watch it today and just see, does this make any sense? Does this add anything to the film? No, it doesn't. So as much as he was able to collaborate and bring in the ideas of others, George Lucas was also able to know when, no, this doesn't work. Thank you for the suggestion. Thank you, everyone in the scene that I've just filmed, like Koo Stark and the other actors, and there's several actors in the scene who just never got their time in Star Wars because the scene was cut. And he just moved on. So finally, the final question I want to consider that the first 10 minutes of Star Wars brings up is this question of who is the hero? That question of Don Glutz, right? Who is the hero? Well, David Fincher, the director, said this recently. Just earlier this year, he said, he thought of Star Wars the story of two slaves who go from owner to owner, witnessing their master's folly, the ultimate folly of man. And of course, the droids are in every film. And, it's not necessarily answering the question of who's the hero, but Fincher is very close because this is who George Lucas considers the hero to be. This guy. R2-D2, he said on the set of Revenge of the Sith, 2004, R2-D2 is dictating the entire story of Star Wars to the keeper of the Journal of the Wills. Remember that? This sort of Bible-like thing that was supposed to be in front of the movie. And about 100 years after the events of Star Wars, all of this is a story told by R2, which sort of explains why he's the hero and saves the day over and over again. He's the only one who doesn't actually ever do anything wrong. He doesn't have his memory wiped at the end of episode 3, unlike 3PO. so he sort of remembers everything. You know, it's another one of those fan theories, but at the same time, it really makes sense when you look at it, and it's one of the reasons why R2-D2 building is such a popular fan activity. The R2 Builders Club actually make better R2-D2s than Lucasfilm did. They make them more cheaply, and they were hired for Star Wars Episode 7 for that very reason. So the R2-D2 that you will see on screen on December the 18th, 2015, was made by actually a couple of British members of the R2 Builders Club, which is very strong here in the Bay Area. But let's go out of universe again and consider who are the heroes of the making of Star Wars. Well, obviously, George Lucas, you can't deny his huge role in this. He was the creative visionary. He had the idea. He did this when everyone was telling him to go do, do his own Chinatown or his own Taxi Driver, right? You're an independent film guy, George. He wanted to make Apocalypse Now. Of course, he was attached to that for many years and had to make that choice of, do I make Apocalypse Now or do I make Star Wars? And finally he said to Coppola, okay, you go make it, and I'll make this kids movie because I think it's really important. So, he deserves a lot of credit for that. But if you study the whole history of Star Wars, the primary thing that worked with that original movie was that he learned to collaborate. He learned to have his friends rewrite 30% of the dialogue. He took in all these great ideas from Ralph McQuarrie, who would just throw in stuff like, yeah, let's have a floating black orb, inject Princess Leia in her holding cell in the Death Star. That was Ralph McQuarrie's design. He was reusing it from another movie. So, that's just a short list of the people who were involved in the first 10 minutes of Star Wars alone that we've been through. And I will take your questions, but that is the end of the talk. And I will just note that the original version of the Force, the full name of it was The Force of Others. And it was very much this notion that it's all about other people and what you can do for other people. And that creates the power of what we know as the Force of Others. So the Force of Others will be with you always. Thank you very much.
Great. So you've painted this picture of collaboration in the first movie. Do you know how that progressed? Was it the same level in the next two movies and the prequels in particular?
Yes, in the next two movies, no, in the prequels. Differing levels of collaboration in each movie. Obviously, they came at different points in George's life. The Empire Strikes Back actually is more of George's story than you would suspect from looking at the credits, which say, Lee Brackett and Lawrence Kasdan wrote the script. Lee Brackett's her first draft was pretty much abandoned. It's just the fact that she died after writing the first draft that kind of preserved her credit up there, but she's not actually that responsible for it. Lawrence Kasdan did a hell of a lot for Empire Strikes Back. Obviously, the look of it was down to Irvin Kershner, or Kirsch as they knew him, the director of that movie. He's very responsible for how it looks and how over budget it went. Return of the Jedi was actually sort of really directed by Lucas. Richard Marquand was the nominal director, but you look at scenes on the set of the two of them talking to the crew, and it's pretty obvious who the crew is listening to. So George sort of thought he was going to be able to direct those two movies by remote control. He pretty soon figured out that he didn't. But he was still open to a lot more collaboration. There are all these great writers' conferences, especially on Return of the Jedi, where they're trying to figure out how is this going to end. He initially had 2 Death Stars. They figured, and had Abaddon was going to be the Imperial capital. We were going to see that. Turned out to be too costly, but they just talked it through, and it was this great brainstorming session. So still very, very collaborative. By the time we get to the prequels, in the words of Mark Hamill, he was so exalted, no one tells him anything. And things were very tightly controlled. He wrote all the scripts. There was, I think, one draft of one of the movies where he got another writer to help out, but But basically it was all him, and it was all him directing. And he was doing it in his sort of signature directing style, which he calls documentary fantasy. The idea being that you just let the actors talk. However they're going to do it, you do it. You don't really give them any direction, except, of course, famously, faster and more intense. Or do it again, only better. That was another good one. But he didn't, he wanted it to just sort of feel natural, so that's why he just let them do it. And mostly directed in the editing room, and with the prequels very much directed with CGI, moving actors around and changing their lip movements and bringing them in for extra takes. So a lot of collaboration in the original trilogy, really not so much, much more sort of dictatorial approach in the prequels. And you can be your own judge as to how that worked out.
I had a question.
Yes.
With episodes 7, 8, and 9 on the horizon, there's differing schools of thought as to whether there was always a 7, 8, and 9 in the 1980s. Has your research come up with anything definitive one way or the other?
It's amazing. This stuff is actually all out in the open. If you track down all the old interviews that George did, you can see the points at which he went up to 9 episodes, and then he went up to 12 episodes. And then in 1980, he started to walk that back and say, no, actually, when I said 12, I was thinking of spin-off films. He was suggesting that one of them was going to be a Wookiee movie, and one of them was going to be a droid movie. And he's like, no, I actually just meant 9. And then after episode 3, after he'd finished the prequels, he came to a Star Wars convention and said, guess what? I never wrote 7, 8, or 9. There was never any idea. That was it. I mean, Dale Pollock, the author of Skywalking, the only official Lucas biography, because he hated the result, said that he had seen, under NDA, treatments for these 7, 8, and 9 movies. There's been no other evidence for it. He won't say what was in them. They may have just been a sentence long, for all we know. But yeah, it looks very much like George was actually telling the truth in 2005 when he said, that's it, I only came up with ideas for the first 6 movies. And this is it's not the first time he's done this. He did that with Spielberg for Indiana Jones. He said, I've come up with 3 stories, he told Spielberg. And Spielberg says this later on. He's like, we had to start from scratch when we did Temple of Doom, the next movie. So, there is this sort of behavior that the creator, as I call him in the book, engages in, which is, I think he likes to think that if he says something is true, it will be true. And if he says there will be a 7, 8, and 9 at some point in the future, then it will be. But so far as we know, he only started writing that in 2012 when he was preparing to sell the company to Disney.
Cool.
Okay, so you have a chapter in here called How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Prequels.
Yes.
Obviously, I'll read the chapter, but just very top level. How?
Well, I think a lot of it comes around to readjusting your expectations and your understanding of what Star Wars was supposed to be. George said in a recent interview with Empire magazine that he's a much goofier director than people give him credit for. And I think that's, once you start to see his films through that lens, it starts to make a lot more sense. He had a different idea of what Star Wars was all along. And his vision, I mentioned that his vision for what became Episode 4, he said that only 25% of it ended up on the screen. The full vision was a lot more like what we got in The Phantom Menace, right? It would have been a lot more planets and monsters and creatures and wacky stuff going on, and very much like a kid's movie. And it's only because he didn't get the budget, he had to cut a lot of scenes out, it became this sort of very spare, Tatooine wasn't supposed to be as Sergio Leone-esque as it became. They just didn't have the budget to do anything more. So that's why in the special edition you get all these extra monsters, CGI screwing up the place, or whatever you think of the special edition. So if you sort of start off from that perspective, this is actually a really goofy, silly, movie series, and that was the idea, and it was an homage to Flash Gordon. I mean, go back and watch Flash Gordon. Go back and watch the serials from the 30s where Flash is fighting this giant lizard, in a split-screen effect. And, this was goofy stuff. It wasn't meant to be taken too seriously. And so I think that's a big part of it. But I do, in that chapter, take you through the 5 stages of prequel grief. And, we go through anger, and we go through bargaining, where everyone talks about what if episode 1 was good? If you remember that YouTube video, got a lot of views. And finally you get to acceptance. And I met a guy who I interviewed in that chapter, who's sort of the prequel preacher, Brian Young. And he has an answer for every single problem you've ever had with the prequels, including Jar Jar Binks. He's supposed to be that annoying. He's supposed to be, just the guy by the side of the road who keeps cropping up in fairy tales and myths of, there's always some guy by the side of the road that you just ignore and you think he's an idiot. Sort of like how Luke first treats Yoda in The Empire Strikes Back, right? I'm looking for a great warrior. Wars make not one great. And Jar Jar is literally supposed to be as annoying as he is, at least to grown-ups. Kids tend to love him. But he still has an important effect. I mean, he's the guy who basically screws up the galaxy by introducing war powers into the Imperial Senate in episode 2. So you think he messed up Star Wars? He literally messed up the Star Wars galaxy. That's sort of the idea of it all. So this is a big part of it. I don't think they're ever going to be as great movies as the original, but it can help you deal with it.
I'm curious, with all the collaborators that you mentioned in the original movies, was there a sense of on set, as they were designing these new technologies, that they were doing something special, revolutionary, that this was going to, change, the impact on culture in epic proportions, or was it just, this could actually bomb, who knows?
Not at all. There was absolutely no sense that this could become as big as it was. One of my favorite quotes along those lines is Ben Burt, the sound designer who came up with so many great things, and the sound of Chewbacca by wafting some milky bread in front of the nose of a starving bear, and then taking the bread away, and then the anguished cry as Chewbacca. Great guy. If anyone was going to recognize the genius of Star Wars, it would be someone like him, because George was always a little bit depressed about this sort of thing. Never imagined it would make any money, and thought it might make a little bit of money, maybe on the toys. And Ben Burt said, the best thing I could imagine was that we would get a table at next year's Star Trek convention. That's how big he was thinking. I mean, it was really just, nobody imagined that this would go mainstream. They made this sort of famous back-of-the-envelope calculation that there's $8 million worth of business from people who will go see any movie called Star Wars, right? And they showed that to 20th Century Fox. Like, yeah? It was based on how many people had gone to see 2001, right? There are just these science fiction fans out there, and they'll go see anything enough to sort of at least kind of maybe make the budget back, and then you get a little bit more than that. Maybe, George said, maybe we'll make as much as the average Disney movie, which made roughly $16 million in that era. And then he said, maybe it's going to be like Davy Crockett. And Davy Crockett was a huge phenomenon in the 50s, and there was this one year where it just went viral, and all the kids were wearing, coonskin caps and firing pop guns. And that's how big he was thinking, even for the toys. He only imagined two merchandising items before he started out: an R2 cookie jar and a Chewbacca mug, like a dog breed mug for Chewbacca. That was it. So it took them all completely by surprise. Everyone, of course, had to scramble. Kenner had to scramble to get the early bird special. If we all remember that, the early bird certificate that would get you your early action figures. And but it just worked. And yes, complete surprise to everyone. I think Steven Spielberg was probably the most positive, who said, no, this is going to make $100 million. It's going to be $100 million movie.
With as big as this show has gotten. I imagine that the people involved in the show have probably still get residuals.
Some people, yes. George handed out points. He played favorites a lot. So, for example, he gave, the cast got a fair amount of points. I think Mark Hamill's point was worth about $600,000 a year, something like that. But also, if you pissed George off, you weren't going to get any points at all, which is why John Dykstra, this genius who put together the Dykstra Flex and changed the face of special effects, got no points at all. Got an Academy Award, no points on the actual movie itself. So there was a lot of bad blood between him and George. And obviously there was a lot of stuff going on before the movie was filmed to tempt certain people in, the biggest example being Alec Guinness. Sir Alec Guinness got 2.5 points before the movie. And that definitely kept him in the style to which he was accustomed. But also Steven Spielberg, not a lot of people know that he and Lucas swapped points on Star Wars and Close Encounters, because Spielberg was like, Star Wars is going to be the bigger movie. Lucas was like, you're crazy, Close Encounters are going to be huge, UFOs, they're this national craze as they were in the 70s. So obviously Close Encounters is going to be a bigger movie. So they swap points, and they basically still, even today, get 2.5% of the profits of each other's movie. And Spielberg says, I did a lot better out of that deal. I think that's been worth $60 million and counting to him, just Spielberg's Star Wars profits alone. It's very odd when you look at the pattern of who made profits out of Star Wars, who were the favorites. It's very interesting. But he did give away a lot of it. I think up to about a quarter of his percentage in Star Wars he gave away. And he didn't need to do that, so he's a pretty generous guy.
I heard a long time ago that George Lucas, in negotiating with Fox, he retained the merchandising rights, and at the time it was typical for the studio to. Is that true?
So the merchandising rights are not. Fox was not as asleep at the switch as we've been led to believe. What Lucas actually had in that contract that gave him the upper hand was the rights to the sequels, which he had to start making by 1979, otherwise they would revert back to 20th Century Fox. But the lawyers went back and forth on this for years. So it wasn't just like Fox said, have the merchandising rights, nobody cares about those. There had actually been recent merchandising efforts. There was Dr. Dolittle. There was some merchandise for Jaws in '75. So there was sort of an awareness that maybe, we shouldn't just give away the house here. And what actually happened was that they shared it 50-50. 20th Century Fox and Lucasfilm got 50-50 profits. But Lucasfilm retained the use of the name Star Wars, and that was solely their property. Which is actually, there's sort of this complex moment in the negotiations where the actual title of the script was Adventures of the Star Killer, Chapter 1, Star Wars. And so it wouldn't have looked like a big deal at that stage to give away the rights to the name, the Star Wars, if that was only the name of Episode 1, right? So I don't know if there was a little bit of financial cunning going on in that portion. But yeah, they only got 50%. It was renegotiated when they sat down and worked out the distribution deal for The Empire Strikes Back. And that's when George had them over a barrel. He said, if you want The Empire Strikes Back, it's going to cost you. And he got up to 77% of the profits from that movie. It was on this sort of sliding scale. And they renegotiated the merchandising rights so that it would eventually revert to Lucasfilm. So it's, you see what I'm saying? It's not as easy as history has made it out to be. There's a little more complex stuff going on, and Fox was not as completely unaware of the possibilities of merchandising as it's been suggested.
Thank you very much, and may the force be with us always.
Thank you.